Hello everyone, what is going on? Raven here, welcome back. Got another horrible crime for y'all to talk about today. This one is all about the Toolbox Killers, aka Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris. These guys have a lot on their page, so let's get right on into it. Let's get into the early first offenses with Bittaker and then Norris, and then we will go from there. Within days of his parole from the California Youth Authority, Bittaker was arrested to transporting a stolen vehicle across state lines. In August of 1959, he was sentenced to 18 months in prison to be served in the Oklahoma State Reformatory. He was later transferred to the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri, to serve the remainder of his sentence. In 1960, he was released from prison and soon reverted back to crime. And arrested in LA for robbery, and in May of 1961 was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. While incarcerated for this robbery, he was characterized by a psychiatrist as being highly manipulative. The psychiatrist also described Bittaker as having considerable concealed hostility. He was released on parole in 1963 after completing 2 years of his sentence. In October of 1964, he was again in prison for parole violation. In 1966, he underwent further examinations of 2 independent psychiatrists, both of whom classified him as a borderline psychopath, a highly manipulative individual, unable to acknowledge the consequences of his actions. Bittaker explained to one of them that his criminal activities gave him a feeling of self-importance, although he insisted circumstantial matters pertaining to his environment and upbringing decreased his ability to resist committing crimes. He was prescribed antipsychotic medication. A year later, he was again released into society. A month after his parole, in July of 1967, Bittaker was again arrested and convicted of theft and of leaving the scene of an accident. He was sentenced to 5 more years but was released in 1970. In 1971, Bittaker was again arrested for burglary. Due to repeated parole violations, he was sentenced to serve between 6 months and 15 years in prison in October 1971. 3 years later, he was again released from prison. In 1974, he was arrested for assault with attempt to commit murder after he stabbed a young supermarket employee who had accused him of stealing. The supermarket employee had observed Bittaker stealing a steak and had followed Bittaker outside and into the store's parking lot, where he and Bittaker he had forgotten to pay. Bittaker responded by stabbing his pursuer in the chest, narrowly missing his heart. He attempted to flee but was quickly restrained by 2 other supermarket employees. The employee in question, Gary Louie, survived the stabbing, and Bittaker was convicted of the lesser charge of assault with a deadly weapon, but sent to California Men's Colony in San Luis. Now, let's get into Norris's early. In November of 1969, Norris was arrested for the first known inappropriate touch offenses. He was charged with both, assault and, the other kind of worse assault, with attempt to commit said assault. In the later incident, he had attempted to force his way into the car of a lone woman. 3 months later, in February of 1970, he attempted to deceive a lone woman into allowing him into her home. When the woman refused, he attempted to break into her house. The woman phoned the police, who arrested Norris before he had the opportunity to cause any harm to the woman. Less than 3 months after this offense, Norris was diagnosed by military psychologists with schizoid personality disorder. He was given an administrative discharge from the Navy under terms labeled as psychological problems. In May of 1970, Norris, on bail for his latest offense, attacked a female student whom he had been stalking on the grounds of San Diego State University campus. Norris repeatedly struck her on the back of the head with a rock until she slumped to her knees before he repeatedly beat her head against the sidewalk as he knelt upon her lower back. Shortly thereafter, he was charged with assault with a deadly weapon. He was committed to 5 years in prison at the Atascadero State Hospital, where he was classified as mentally disordered offender. Norris was released from the state hospital in 1975 with 5 years probation, having been declared by doctors as an individual who has no further danger to others. Just 3 months after his release, he approached a 27-year-old woman walking home from a restaurant in Redondo Beach and offered her a ride on his motorcycle. When she declined, he parked his motorcycle and grabbed the woman's scarf, twisting it around her neck before informing her he intended to assault her. Dragging her into nearby bushes, fearing for her life, the woman did not resist. Although the assault was reported to police, they were initially unable to find the perpetrator. However, 1 month later, the victim observed his motorcycle and noted the license number, which she immediately gave to police. Norris was arrested for the assault. 1 year later, he was tried and convicted for this offense and sent to California Men's Culinary in San Luis. While incarcerated there, he met and befriended Bittaker. At this point on, it's going to get really rough. This is where the 5 murders have happened together. This is where they became known as the Toolbox Killers. Lucinda Lynn Schaefer was the first victim of Bittaker and Norris as a team together. She was 16 years old at the time. She was last leaving a church meeting in Redondo Beach. In written accounts of the events of the day, Bittaker stated he and Norris first finished constructing the bed that they had in their van. At approximately 11 a.m., the pair drove to the beach area, drinking beer, smoking some grass, and flirting with girls. They had no set routine as of this point. At 7:46 p.m., Norris spotted her walking down a side street towards her grandmother's home, which is where she was walking to from the church. And they said, "There's a cute little blonde." After unsuccessfully attempting to entice her into the van with alternative offers of smoking some grass and a lift home, Bittaker and Norris drove further ahead and parked alongside a driveway. They then had Norris exited the vehicle, opened the passenger side sliding door, leaned into the van with his head and shoulders obscured from view behind the door. When Schaefer passed the van, Norris exchanged a few words with her before dragging her into the van and closing the door. Using a ruse they would repeat in most of their horrible murders, Bittaker turned the radio to full volume as Norris bound the victim's arms and legs and gagged her with duct tape. As Bittaker drove Schaefer to the fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains, where in April the pair had previously switched the locks because they wanted to be able to commit crimes. Despite initially screaming when she was abducted, Schaefer quickly regained her composure. In written accounts of the night that followed, Bittaker wrote that Schaefer displayed a magnificent state of self-control and composed acceptance of the conditions of which she had no control. She had no tears shed, she offered no resistance, and expressed no great concern for her safety. At the fire road, Norris first assaulted Schaefer after instructing Bittaker to quote-unquote go take a walk and return in an hour. Upon returning to the van, Bittaker similarly assaulted the girl in Norris's absence. Upon the second occasion in which she was assaulted by both the boys, Schaefer asked whether they intended to kill her, to which Norris replied at the time, no. In response, Schaefer requested to be allowed time to pray before she was killed if that was their intention. In their subsequent accounts of the actual murder, Bittaker and Norris gave different accounts as to who argued over whether they should unalive her rather than release her. Each stated that the other argued that they should unalive her. In any event, Schaefer pleaded for only a second to pray before Norris attempted to manually strangle her. After approximately 45 seconds, he became disturbed at the look in her eyes, ran to the front of the van, and vomited. Bittaker then manually strangled her until she collapsed to the ground and began convulsing. He then twisted a wire coat hanger around her neck with vice grip pliers until her convulsions ceased. Schaefer was denied her request to pray before they took her life. Her body was wrapped in a plastic shower curtain and thrown over a steep canyon that Bittaker selected. According to Norris, after Bittaker had thrown Schaefer over the canyon, Bittaker assured him that the animals would eat her, so there would be no evidence On July 8th, 1979, 2 weeks after the murder of Schaefer, Bittaker Norris encountered 18-year-old Andrea Joy Hall. She was hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway. As the pair slowed the van to offer her a lift, another vehicle pulled over and offered Hall exactly that, which she accepted. Bittaker and Norris followed the vehicle from a distance until Hall exited the vehicle in Redondo Beach. On this occasion, Norris hid in the back of the van in order to dupe Hall into believing Bittaker was traveling alone. Inside the van, Bittaker offered Hall a cold drink from the cooler in the rear of the van. Norris, who had hidden behind a bedspread in the rear of the van, pounced on Hall when she attempted to retrieve the drink, and after a strenuous fight, managed to subdue her by twisting her arm behind her back, causing her to scream in pain. Norris then gagged Hall with adhesive tape and bound her wrists and ankles. Bittaker and Norris drove Hall to a location in the San Gabriel Mountains beyond where they had earlier taken Schaefer. At this location, she was assaulted twice by Bittaker and once by Norris. While Bittaker was assaulting Hall for the second time, Norris saw what he believed to be a vehicle headlights approaching Bittaker, clasped his hand over Hall's mouth and dragged her into nearby bushes as Norris drove in an unsuccessful search for the vehicle he thought he had seen. When he returned, the pair drove to a location farther in the San Gabriel Mountains. Bittaker forced Hall to walk uphill naked alongside the road and then to perform oral on him, before ordering Hall to pose for several Polaroid pictures. Bittaker and Norris then drove Hall to a third location where Bittaker again walked Hall up a nearby hill. This time, as Norris drove to a nearby store to purchase alcohol. When Norris returned, Bittaker was alone and in possession of 2 further Polaroid pictures he had taken, both of which depict Hall's face expressions Norris later described as being of sheer terror, as she begged for her life to be spared. Bittaker informed Norris that he had told Hall he was going to unalive her and challenged her to give him as many reasons as she could come up with as to why she should be allowed to live, before thrusting an ice pick through her ear into her brain. He then turned her body over and thrust the ice pick into her other ear, stomping on it until the handle broke off. He then strangled Hall before throwing her body off of the cliff. Up next, on September 3rd, Bittaker Norris observed 2 girls, the one named Jackie Doris Gilliam and the other one named Jacqueline Leah Lamp, sitting on a bus stop near Hermosa Beach. Lamp and Gilliam had been hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway before Bittaker and Norris observed them as they were resting at the bus stop. Bittaker and Norris offered the girls a ride, which they both accepted. Inside the van, both girls were offered marijuana by Norris, which they had also accepted. Shortly after entering the van, both girls realized that Bittaker had steered the van off of the Pacific Coast Highway and was driving the direction of the San Gabriel Mountains. When the girls protested, both Bittaker and Norris attempted to allay the girls' concerns with excuses, which did not deceive either one. Lamp, who was 13 years old, attempted to open the sliding door, whereupon Norris hit her on the back of the head with a bag filled with lead weights, briefly knocking her unconscious before overpowering 15-year-old Gilliam. As he began to bind and gag Gilliam, Lamp regained consciousness and again attempted to flee the van, whereupon Norris twisted her arm behind her back, dragged her back into the van. As a struggle ensued, Bittaker, noting the girl's struggle was in full view of potential witnesses, stopped the van, punched Gilliam in the face, and assisted Norris in finishing binding and gagging the 2 girls. They were driven to the San Gabriel Mountains, where they were held captive for almost 2 days, being bound and gagged between repeated instances of more than one type of abuse, being like hit and SA'd. Both men slept in the van alongside their 2 hostages, with each alternatively acting as a lookout. On one occasion, Bittaker walked Lamp onto a nearby hill and forced her to pose for inappropriate photos before returning her to the van. Bittaker also asked Norris to take several Polaroid pictures of himself and Gilliam, both nude and clothed. In the first of the 3 instances in which Bittaker S.A. Gilliam, he also created a tape recording of himself doing that to her. forcing the girl to pretend she was his cousin, and informing Gilliam to feel free to express her pain. Bittaker is also known to have tortured Gilliam by stabbing her chest with an ice pick and using vice grip pliers to tear off the middle of... I am sorry, but the fact that he used vice grip pliers to tear off part of one of her nipples, that is horrifying. And horribly painful, and oh my lord. After almost 2 days of captivity, Lamb and Gilliam were murdered. At Bittaker's subsequent trial, Norris claimed he had suggested that Gilliam be killed quickly, as unlike Lamb, she had been largely cooperative throughout the period of her captivity. Whereupon Bittaker replied, no, they only die once anyway. Gilliam was struck in each ear with an ice pick and then strangled to death. After Bittaker had murdered Gilliam, he then forced Lamb out of the van. Upon exiting the sliding door, Bittaker shouted to her, you wanted to stay a virgin, now you can die of one. Before Norris struck her upon the head with a sledgehammer, Bittaker then strangled her until he believed she had passed away. When Lamb opened her eyes, Norris bludgeoned her repeatedly as Bittaker strangled her. The bodies of Gilliam and Lamb were thrown over an embankment into the chaparral. On October 31st, 1979, Bittaker and Norris abducted their final victim, 16-year-old Shirley Lynette Ledford. Ledford was abducted as she stood outside a gas station hitchhiking home from a Halloween party, Sunland Tujunga suburb of L.A. Investigators believe Ledford accepted a ride home from Bittaker and Norris because she recognized Bittaker, as he is known to have frequented the restaurant which Ledford had a part-time job as a waitress. Upon accepting the offer of a lift home and entering the van, she was offered marijuana by Norris, which she refused. Bittaker drove the van to a secluded street where Norris drew a knife and bound and gagged her with construction tape. Bittaker then traded places with Norris, who drove in an aimless manner for an excess of an hour, as Bittaker remained with Ledford in the back of the van. After removing the construction tape from the girl's mouth and legs, Bittaker tormented her, initially slapping and mocking her, then beating her with his fist as he repeatedly shouted for her to say something. Then, as Ledford began screaming, shouting for her to scream louder. As Ledford continued screaming, Bittaker began asking her as he struck her, "What's the matter? Don't you like to scream?" As Ledford began to cry, she pleaded with Bittaker, saying repeatedly something as along the lines of, "No, don't touch me," in response. Bittaker again ordered her to scream as loud as she wished, then began alternatively striking her with a hammer, beating her breast with his fists, and torturing her with pliers, both between and throughout instances where he essayed and sodomized her. Repeatedly, Ledford can be heard pleading for the abuse to cease and making statements such as, "Oh no, no." As sounds of Bittaker alternately extracting either the sledgehammer or the pliers from the toolbox can be heard on a tape recorder he had switched on after entering the rear of the van. Norris later described hearing screams, constant screams emanating from the rear of the van. Shortly after Norris switched places with Bittaker, he himself switched on the tape recorder that Bittaker had used to record much of the time he had been in the rear of the van with her. Norris first shouted to, "Go ahead and scream or I'll make you scream." In response, Ledford pleaded, "I'll scream if you stop hitting me." Then emitted several high-pitched screams as Norris encouraged her to continue until he ordered her to stop. Norris then reached for the sledgehammer as Ledford, seeing him do this, screamed, "Oh no!" Norris then struck her once upon the left elbow. In response, she informed Norris he had broken her elbow before pleading, "Don't hit me again." In response, Norris again raised the sledgehammer as Ledford repeatedly screamed, "No!" Norris then proceeded to strike Ledford 25 consecutive times upon the same elbow with the sledgehammer, before asking her, "What are you sniveling about?" She continuously screamed and wept. After approximately 2 hours of captivity, Norris killed her by strangling her with a wire coat hanger, which he tightened with pliers. Ledford did not react much to the act of strangulation, although she died with her eyes open. Bittaker then opted to discard her body on a random lawn in order to view the reaction from the press. The pair drove to a randomly selected house in Sunderland, where Norris discarded her body in a bed of ivy upon the front lawn. Ledford's body was found by a jogger the following morning. An autopsy revealed that in addition to having been violated, she had died of strangulation after receiving excessive blunt force trauma to the face, head, breast, and left elbow, with her ollocranium, which it is a thick, curved, bony eminence of the ulna, which is part of the forearm, where the elbow kind of sits, sustaining multiple fractures. Her genitalia and rectum had been torn, caused in part by Bittaker having inserted pliers inside of her body. Oh dear Lord. In addition, her left hand bore a puncture wound and a finger on her right hand had been slashed. Bittaker would later claim the tape recording the pair had created of Ledford's clear abuse and torture offered nothing other than the evidence of a threesome, adding that towards the very end, Ledford was screaming for him and Norris to kill her. In November of 1979, Norris became reacquainted with a friend named Joseph Jackson, an individual with whom he had previously been incarcerated at the California Men's Colony. Norris confided in Jackson regarding his and Bittaker's exploits over the previous 5 months, including all the graphic details of the murder of Shirley Ledford, the only victim whose body had been found at this time. Norris also divulged to Jackson that in addition to the 5 murders he and Bittaker had committed, there had been 3 additional incidents in which he and Bittaker had abducted or attempted to abduct young women who had either escaped their attackers or in one instance had actually been SA'd but released. Upon hearing these confessions, Jackson consulted his attorney, who advised him to inform the authorities. Jackson agreed, and he and his attorney informed the LAPD, who in turn relayed the 2 men to the beach police. A report was filed on September 30th. A young woman named Robin Roebuck had been sprayed in the face with mace before being dragged into a van and essayed by 2 Caucasian men in their mid-30s before being released. Although she had reported the abduction and abuse to the police, they had been unable to identify her assailants. But the 2 individuals she identified were Bittaker and Norris. On November 20th, 1979, Norris was arrested by the Hermosa Beach police for parole violation. The same day, at the Burbank Motel, Bittaker was arrested for the abuse of Robin Roebuck. Although she had identified them via mugshots, she was unable to positively identify her assailants in a police lineup. Nonetheless, police had observed Norris dealing in marijuana, whereas Bittaker had been in possession of drugs at the time of his arrest, so both were held on charges of parole violation. A search of Bittaker's apartment revealed several Polaroid photos, which were determined as depicting Hall and Gilliam, both of whom had been reported missing earlier the same year. Inside Bittaker's van, investigators discovered a sledgehammer, a plastic bag filled with lead weights, a book detailing how to locate police radio frequencies, a jar of Vaseline, 2 necklaces later confirmed as belonging to 2 of their victims, and a tape recording of a young woman in distress, screaming and repeatedly pleading for mercy while being abused and tortured. The mother of Ledford, named by Jackson as being one of the girls whom Norris had confessed he and Bittaker had killed, identified the voice of the tape as being that of her only daughter. The voices of the 2 men mocking and threatening her in the process of her torture and abuse were identified as being Roy Norris and Lawrence Bittaker. Also found in Bittaker's motel were 7 bottles of various acidic materials. Investigators would later discover Bittaker planned to use these materials on their next victim. Inside Norris's apartment, police discovered a bracelet he had taken from Ledford's body as a souvenir. Also found at the homes of both Bittaker and Norris were Polaroid pictures of almost 500 teenage girls and young women, most of which had apparently been taken at the Redondo Beach and Hermosa Beach, with others taken by Bittaker at a Burbank high school. Most of these pictures had been taken without their knowledge or consent. On November 30th, 1979, Norris attended a preliminary hearing in relation to the September 30th assault. By this point, Norris was beginning to display visible signs of distress. At the hearing, Norris waived his Miranda rights before Detective Byram and Deputy District Attorney Stephen Kay began questioning him, initially in relation to the assault of Robin, then in relation to the statements given to police by Joseph Jackson and the evidence recovered from his and Bittaker's residences. Initially, Norris flatly denied any involvement in any of the murders, assaults, disappearances. However, when confronted with the evidence investigators had compiled, Norris began to confess, although he did not attempt to portray Bittaker as being more culpable in the murders than himself. In what Burnham and Kay later described as a casual, unconcerned matter, Norris divulged that he and Bittaker had been in the habit of driving around areas such as the Pacific Coast Highway and randomly approaching girls whom they found attractive with others of a ride, posing with the pair for photographs or marijuana. Most of those whom they approached rejected whatever given ruse Bittaker and Norris used to entice them into the van. Although 4 girls had accepted this from the pair that had been unalived, the 5th victim, or their first victim, being grabbed by force. Inside the van, the girls are typically overpowered, bound hand and foot, gagged, and driven to locations deep within the mountains where they would be assaulted and, murdered, unfortunately. According to Norris, the level of brutality Bittaker had exhibited toward their victims had increased on each successive instance they had lured a girl into the van. Their final victim, Ledford, had actually pleaded to be killed in order that her agony could cease. Additional details by Norris provided further corroborating evidence to support this confession. One of the Polaroid pictures seized from Bittaker and Norris depicts an unidentified young white female alone with Bittaker and Norris in circumstances very similar to the pictures found depicting known victims like Hall, Lamp, Gilliam. The young woman in the pictures has never been identified. This photo is indicative that there may be another victim, whom neither Bittaker or Norris have ever mentioned to investigators. Norris agreed to return to the San Gabriel Mountains to search for the bodies of the girls whose abduction and murder he had confessed to assisting in. In each instance, Norris brought detectives to the area where he and Bittaker disposed of their bodies. Despite extensive searches of the areas where he had stated the bodies of Schaefer and Hall had been discarded, their bodies were never found. On February 9th, 1980, the skeletalized bodies of Lamp and Gilliam were found at the bottom of a canyon alongside a dry riverbed. The bodies were scattered over an area measuring hundreds of feet in diameter. An ice pick was still lodged in the skull of Gilliam. The skull of Lamp bore multiple indentations, evidence of numerous hammer blows Norris had stated he inflicted. In February 1980, Norris and Bittaker are formally charged with the murders of the 5 girls. At the arraignment, Bittaker was denied bail, whereas Norris's bail was set to $10,000. Within 1 month of his being charged with murder, Norris had accepted a plea bargain in which he would testify against Bittaker in return for the prosecution agreeing not to seek the death penalty against him. On March 24th, in accordance with the jury verdict, Bittaker was formally sentenced to death in the event that the sentence imposed was ever reverted to life imprisonment. Judge Thomas Fredericks imposed an alternative sentence of 199 years, 4 months imprisonment to take immediate effect. After all this, and he is in prison for the rest of his life, Bittaker granted several death row interviews following his 1981 conviction. He never expressed any remorse for his crimes, repeatedly stating the only remorse he felt he had been for the fact that he and Norris were arrested, thus ruining his own life. He corresponded with numerous individuals, responding to letters, and he received the nickname Pliers. Bittaker, in reference to one of the implements he and Norris had used to torture the victims. While incarcerated, Bittaker filed more than 40 frivolous lawsuits over issues as trivial as his being served a broken cookie and crushed sandwiches by the prison cafeteria, which he cited as examples of being subjected to cruel and unusual punishment. Bittaker was declared a vexatious litigant in 1993. As a result of this declaration, he was not allowed to file lawsuits without the express permission of an attorney or a judge. When asked in 2016 if he would consider writing to the victims' families, Bittaker claimed he was too ashamed to even try and beg for forgiveness. The sincerity of his expressions of remorse had been disputed by numerous professionals who referenced Bittaker's constant reveling in his notoriety and who noted the fact that he would tailor his outlook on his actions to one of regret, whose attention he wished to maintain. Bittaker died while incarcerated on death row at San Quentin State Prison on December 13, 2019, at the age of 79. His death was reported to be due as natural causes. Norris was incarcerated at the Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility. He died of natural causes on February 24, 2020, at the age of 72, having been transferred to this facility 1 week prior to his passing. In the years following Norris's conviction, he had repeatedly claimed the sole reason he participated in the murders was out of fear of Bittaker. Norris also claimed to have twice contemplated confessing to his and Bittaker's responsibility in the murders to the police. He also claimed to have deterred 3 potential victims from entering Bittaker's van. Although Norris readily admitted that he enjoyed the acts of assault with the victims, he claimed only Bittaker enjoyed the acts of torture and murder. He said, "I don't enjoy killing. That was all Bittaker. It was his favorite part, watching them struggle to live, knowing he'd soon be taking life away." Investigators and psychologists have stated Norris derived equally extreme gratification from the domination, abuse, and torture inflicted upon the victims as Bittaker did. These respective parties have also harked toward Norris's extensive history of physical and abusal of violence against women prior to his meeting of Bittaker, and his repeated instances of denial of culpability for his actions. Norris initially became eligible for parole in 2009. He declined to attend the parole hearing, thereby automatically deferring this parole eligibility for another 10 years. He was denied parole again in 2019 and died while still incarcerated the following year. Hearing and reading this case in particular was definitely one of the worst ones I've read in a long time. There was so much more in depth to this than I had initially heard about. I do hope all of their victims, no matter if it was 5 or more, find peace. I hope that they can spiritually move on from the trauma. I do hope that their families are able to heal as much as they can, and I hope that they can find a way to find some sort of joy throughout the rest of their lives. I will also mention this before I go ahead and sign off for the day, that there was video about this whole thing in general and how a woman had become close to Bittaker while he was on death row. Before he passed away, she convinced him to tell his side of the story, and she also convinced him to help find the bodies of the girls who were not found yet. It is because of Bittaker opening up and telling them where to look that they were able to find the other girls' bodies and bring them home. I am unsure as of why he chose to tell the truth of where the girls' bodies were as of that point. Unfortunately, there would be no open casket for pretty much any of these girls. And the fact that the ice pick was stuck in the one girl's skull is completely traumatizing and horrifying. I'm going to need some time to recover after this. I'm going to probably take a few days to not do any more crime videos for a little bit, because this, as I said, this is probably one of the worst ones I've done in a while. And it is appalling what the guys have done to those poor girls. I hope everyone rests in peace, and I will see you on the next video.